My name is Margot Hayes, and I am 66 years old. The story I am about to tell you is one I never imagined I would live to tell. It begins on the quietest, most shattered day of my life, the day we buried my husband, Ernest. The air in Spring Creek Cemetery was thick with a damp chill that seeped right through my black dress, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the hollowed-out space where my heart used to be. I stood there, a widow of just 3 days. Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. Watching as the love of my life, my partner for 42 years, was lowered into the cold, unyielding earth. The finality of that moment was a physical weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to even stand. I remember the sound more than anything. The dull, thudding rhythm of dirt hitting the polished wood of the casket. Each thud was a hammer blow on the coffin nail of my old life. Each one screamed that he was gone, that I was truly alone. My legs felt like water, and I would have crumpled right there onto the fresh-turned soil if it weren't for my dear friend, Doris, her arm a steadfast anchor around my waist, holding me up when my own strength had completely deserted me. "Be strong, Margot," she whispered, her voice husky with her own tears. "Ernest would want to see you strong." But I didn't feel strong. I felt like a ship with its mast sheared off, adrift in a black and endless sea. 42 years of marriage cannot be buried so easily. You don't just say goodbye to the man who was your home, your refuge, your reason for smiling for over 4 decades. My eyes, blurred with tears, drifted from that horrible, gaping hole in the ground to the 2 figures standing opposite me. My sons, Charles and Henry, my boys. The 2 beautiful babies I had nursed and raised, the children whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose nightmares I had chased away. They stood side by side, their postures straight, their faces arranged in masks of solemn grief. But even through the haze of my own unbearable pain, something felt off. Their tears seemed forced, theatrical. When Charles had hugged me earlier, his embrace felt as cold and stiff as the starched collar of his expensive shirt. Henry's eyes, which should have been pools of shared devastation, just looked restless. He kept shifting his weight, his gaze darting around the small gathering as if he were counting the minutes until he could leave. The service itself had been a strangely rushed and hollow affair. Charles had taken charge of all the arrangements with an efficiency that felt more corporate than compassionate. He'd chosen the simplest casket, the shortest possible service, as if he were tidying up an inconvenient business matter. When I'd meekly asked why I hadn't been consulted, why there weren't more of Ernest's friends from the bike shop or more neighbors from our street, he'd patted my hand with a condescension that made my skin crawl. "It's what Dad would have wanted, Mom," he'd said, his voice smooth as glass. "Something simple, no fuss." But Ernest deserved fuss. He deserved a crowd. He deserved stories and laughter mixed with the tears. He deserved a send-off fit for the good, honest, beloved man he was. This felt like a secret, something to be gotten over with as quickly and quietly as possible. And the crowd, or rather, the lack of one. For a man who had lived all his 70 years in Spring Creek, who had fixed the bicycles of every child in this town, and half their parents too, the gathering was pitifully small. It was just us, Doris, the pastor, and Charles's wife, Jasmine, who stood slightly apart, her elegant black veil doing little to hide the fact that she was discreetly checking her phone. "Where is everyone?" I'd whispered to Charles. "Where are the men from the shop? The Johnsons from down the road?" He hadn't quite met my eyes. "We didn't want to bother anyone, Mom. Dad was a private person. He would have preferred something intimate." Another lie. I felt it in my bones. Ernest was the least private person I knew. He loved people, loved his community. He would have been deeply hurt by this sparse, lonely farewell. Why was Charles so determined to erase his father? The pastor's words about eternal rest and God's loving embrace washed over me, meaningless and distant. I didn't want Ernest to rest. I wanted him to come home. I wanted to hear the familiar creak of the porch step as he came in for dinner, smell the faint scent of motor oil and honest sweat on his clothes, feel the rough, warm comfort of his hand in mine. I wanted our life back. The life we had built from nothing, with love and hard work, and countless shared cups of coffee on that very porch. It was then, at that exact moment of absolute desolation, as I watched a shovelful of dark earth fall onto the casket with a sound that would haunt me forever, that I felt it. A vibration in my purse. A soft, insistent buzz against my hip. In any other context, it would have been ignorable. But in the profound silence of my grief, it was an intrusion, a jarring note from a world that was still turning, cruelly, without him. My hands, already trembling, fumbled with the clasp of my purse. Doris gave me a questioning look, but I just shook my head, a tiny, desperate movement. I don't know why I felt such an urgent need to look. Perhaps it was a distraction from the unbearable reality in front of me. Perhaps it was some deeper instinct, a pull I couldn't name. I slid the phone out, the screen bright and alien in the somber daylight. A text message. From a number I didn't recognize. My brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion cutting through the numbness. Who would be texting me now? My heart, which I thought had turned to stone, gave a single, hard thud against my ribs. I tapped the screen. The words that appeared are seared into my memory, as clear and shocking now as they were in that moment. They were simple, they were impossible. I'm alive. I stared, my mind refusing to process the letters. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This was a cruel joke. A monstrous prank played on a grieving widow at her lowest point. My breath hitched, a sob of anger and despair rising in my throat. My fingers, clumsy and shaking, typed a reply. That's not me in the casket. The response was immediate, as if the person on the other end had been waiting, watching. Who are you? I typed, the letters a frantic jumble. The 3 dots appeared, pulsed, and then the answer came. It was a reply that didn't just send a chill through me. It plunged my entire world into an icy, terrifying darkness. I can't say. They're watching. Don't trust our sons. Our sons. The phone fell from my hand as if it had burned me, landing soundlessly on the soft grass. Doris bent to retrieve it, but I was faster, my movement sharp and sudden. No, I said, the word coming out as a strangled cry. I snatched the phone back, clutching it to my chest like a stolen secret. I couldn't let her see. I couldn't let anyone see. Not until I understood what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Was the grief so overwhelming that it had conjured this horrific hallucination? Are you okay, Mom? Charles's voice cut through my panic. He was suddenly beside me, his face a mask of concerned solicitude. His hand reached out to steady my arm, but I flinched away. I looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time since this nightmare began. I searched his face, his eyes, for some sign, some flicker of the boy I'd raised. His expression seemed sincere, filled with a son's worry for his mother. But now, poisoned by those 5 devastating words. Don't trust our sons. Every gesture felt rehearsed. Every line of concern on his face felt like a carefully drawn lie. I'm fine, I lied, my voice thin and reedy. I shoved the phone deep into my purse, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I need to go home. I need to be alone. The ride back to the house was a blur. Doris drove, her kind words of comfort washing over me without meaning. I sat in the passenger seat, stiff and silent, staring out the window at a town that looked exactly the same but felt utterly alien. My mind was a whirlwind, replaying every strange detail of the past few days. The accident itself had been so sudden, so convenient. Ernest, my meticulous, careful Ernest, who knew every nut and bolt in his shop, falling victim to a mysterious machine explosion. And my sons, how had they arrived at the hospital so quickly, even before I had? The hospital had called me. I was his emergency contact. Yet, when I'd arrived, breathless and terrified, they were already there, calm and collected, talking to doctors in hushed, serious tones. And then there was the money. From the very first day in that hospital waiting room, their conversations had been laced with talk of insurance policies and beneficiaries. Charles, on his phone, discussing life insurance payouts. Henry, asking about workers' compensation. While their father fought for his life, their minds were on the financial logistics of his death. At the time, I'd been too distraught to see it for what it was. I'd chalked it up to stress, to a misguided attempt to be practical in the face of tragedy. But now, those memories took on a new, sinister hue. We pulled up to the house, my house, our house. The two-bedroom home, with the tin roof, that Ernest and I had bought with so much hope and so little money. Where we had raised our boys, where we had grown old together. Every shingle, every flaking patch of paint, held a memory. Now, it just looked like a tomb. "I'll come in with you, Margot," Doris said, her hand on my arm. "You shouldn't be alone." "No," I said, perhaps too quickly. I forced a weak smile. "Thank you, Doris, truly. But I need to be with his things. I need to just sit." She looked uncertain, her kind eyes filled with worry, but she finally nodded. "All right, but I'm just a phone call away. Any time, day or night. You hear me?" I nodded, squeezing her hand before stepping out of the car. I walked up the path to the porch, my legs carrying me on autopilot. The key felt heavy and foreign in my hand as I unlocked the door. Stepping inside was the hardest part. The silence was deafening. It was a different silence from the one at the cemetery. This was a domestic silence, a silence that highlighted absence. His worn leather chair was empty. His coffee mug, the one with the chipped handle that he refused to throw away, sat clean and lonely on the drain board. The house still smelled faintly of him, a mix of sawdust, coffee, and his simple, clean soap. I didn't take off my coat. I just stood in the middle of the living room, clutching my purse with the phone inside it like a lifeline. The message echoed in my mind, a relentless, terrifying mantra. "I'm alive. Don't trust our sons." Was it possible? Could Ernest truly be alive? The thought was so ludicrous, so desperately hopeful, that it felt dangerous to even entertain it. I had seen his body. I had kissed his cold forehead for the last time. I had watched the casket be sealed. The rational part of my brain, the part that was still functioning, knew that he was gone. But what if? What if it wasn't him? What if it was someone else in that casket? The idea was monstrous, unthinkable. And if it wasn't him, who was sending these messages? Who knew enough about our family, about the growing tension with our sons, to send such a specific, devastating warning? The phrase "our sons" implied a shared parenthood. It had to be someone close, someone who knew the intimate dynamics of our family. A cold dread, colder than the grave dirt, began to seep into my veins. This wasn't just grief. This was fear. This was the beginning of a terrifying mystery, and I was standing at its very center, completely alone. The message had torn my soul in two. One half was a grieving widow, desperate to mourn her husband in peace. The other half was a woman suddenly thrust into a shadowy world of lies and suspicion, forced to question the very people she was supposed to be able to trust most in the world. I walked to the kitchen table and sank into a chair, the same chair where Ernest and I had shared thousands of meals, where we had planned our future, where we had laughed and argued and loved. I pulled out the phone again, my fingers trembling as I opened the message thread. I stared at those words until they lost all meaning, becoming just strange shapes on a screen. They're watching. I got up and walked to the window, peering through the lace curtains out into the quiet street. Was someone out there? Were Charles and Henry having me followed? The paranoia was immediate, a sickening vine twisting around my heart. Everything felt threatening. The rustle of a tree branch in the wind sounded like a footstep. The distant hum of a car engine felt like a surveillance vehicle. I was adrift in an ocean of doubt, and that text message was both a lifeline and a storm warning. It offered a sliver of impossible hope, but it also promised a world of pain and betrayal. My husband was gone, but he had left behind a mystery. And my sons, the flesh of my flesh, were at the heart of it. The war for the truth had begun, right there, in the quiet of my empty home, on the worst day of my life. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed the funeral were a strange, liminal space, a blur of casseroles brought by well-meaning neighbors and the oppressive, ticking silence that filled the spaces between their visits. Every object in our home had become a relic, a museum piece from a lost civilization. His coffee mug, his work boots by the door, still caked with a little dirt from the shop. The indentation on his side of the sofa, a hollow I found myself staring at, for hours, as if I could summon him back by sheer force of will. But now a new, terrifying energy hummed beneath the grief. The message. Those 5 words, "Don't trust our sons," had infected my memories, casting long, sinister shadows over what I had always believed was the truth of my life. I found myself drawn to the photo albums, the heavy, leather-bound books that held our history. I used to look at them with a sweet, aching nostalgia. Now, it felt like I was a detective examining a crime scene, searching for clues I never knew were there. I traced the faces of my sons as they grew, from gap-toothed grins to the polished, distant smiles of men in expensive suits. Where had the light in their eyes gone? When had it been replaced by that hard, calculating gleam? The cracks in our family picture frame, I realized, hadn't appeared overnight. They had been slowly spiderwebbing for years, and I, in my desperate hope that everything would return to how it was, had simply chosen not to see them. It started with the houses. Not long after Charles married Jasmine, he bought a house. Not just any house. A $200,000 home in an exclusive city neighborhood. The number was so astronomical to Ernest and me, it might as well have been $1 million. Henry, never one to be outdone, followed soon after with a luxury condo that cost $150,000. Suddenly, our sons were owners of fortunes we couldn't even conceptualize. We should have been proud, I suppose. But the news was delivered, with a smugness that felt more like a declaration of war on our simple existence. They brought brochures. Jasmine, during one of her rare, perfumed visits, slid a glossy pamphlet for Willow Grove Retirement Community across my kitchen table. The people in the photographs had unnaturally white teeth and were playing shuffleboard with looks of manic joy. "You'd be so much more comfortable, Margot," she said, her voice like syrup. "There are activities, medical care, on site. People your own age." The word community hit me like a slap, a retirement community. After 40 years of building this home, of raising a family within these walls, of loving and losing and living a full life here, they wanted to send us to a home. It felt like being erased. Ernest, God bless his steadfast soul, had replied with a dignity that made my heart swell. "We don't need a home, Jasmine. We're fine right here, in our house." But I saw the look that passed between Charles and Henry. It wasn't disappointment. It was frustration, annoyance. We were an inconvenient piece of furniture that wouldn't fit their new, sleek interior design, We were a problem to be solved in the most efficient way possible. The suggestions became less subtle, more direct. Charles arrived one day, unannounced, a sheaf of papers in his hand. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So, if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He had that smile plastered on his face, the one that didn't reach his eyes, the one he'd perfected in his business meetings. "Dad, Mom," he began, as if he were about to present a brilliant investment opportunity. "I've been thinking about your future." He spread the papers on the table. They were documents he'd had prepared without our knowledge or consent. Appraisals, market analyses. "This house," he said, tapping the page with his finger, "is worth, at most, $1,000. The land might be worth a little more. If you sell it, I can add some money, a significant amount, so you can move somewhere better. A proper place." To us, there was no place better. This was the place where Ernest had proposed to me on one knee in the kitchen, where we'd danced in the leaking rain, where we'd painted the nursery a soft yellow for Charles. But Charles didn't understand that. For him, everything had been reduced to numbers, to monetary value. Sentiment was a line item with a value of 0. "Besides," he continued, his gaze shifting to Ernest, "I think Dad should retire from the shop. He's 70 years old. It's time to rest." I saw the pain flash in Ernest's eyes, quickly masked. "Son," he said, his voice calm but firm, "working isn't a burden for me. It's what keeps me alive. It's what gives my days meaning." "But you could get hurt," Henry chimed in, backing up his brother as he always did. His voice held a strange, rehearsed concern. "At your age, an accident would be very dangerous. We just worry about you." Their words sounded caring on the surface, but I sensed something else lurking beneath, an impatience, an urgency I couldn't quite grasp at the time. Now, with the message echoing in my mind, their words took on a far more sinister meaning. An accident would be very dangerous. Was that a prediction, or was it a plan? The following months were a slow, grinding pressure. My sons became like water wearing away at stone. They brought real estate agents to the house without telling us. Strangers who walked through our home, our sanctuary, pointing out dated fixtures and deferred maintenance as if our life together was a list of flaws. They had the property officially appraised without our permission. They began to use a new phrase, one that made my skin crawl: "What's best for everyone." It all came to a head during one particularly uncomfortable dinner. The air was so thick with tension you could carve it. Jasmine was there, picking at her food as usual. Charles cleared his throat, a sure sign he was about to deliver a rehearsed speech. "Look," he said, putting down his fork. "Jasmine and I have decided to try for kids soon. Starting a family is expensive. We'll need help with the expenses." My heart gave a little leap. A grandchild? A tiny, innocent life to love? For a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of the future I'd dreamed of, a baby in my arms, Ernest's proud smile. But Charles shattered the moment. "If you sell the house and move to a smaller place, that money could be an early inheritance. It would help us get started." An early inheritance. The audacity of it stole the breath from my lungs. He was asking for his inheritance while we were still alive. He was so impatient for our money that he couldn't wait for us to die a natural death. The sheer, naked greed of the request left me speechless, my mouth opening and closing like a fish. Ernest remained preternaturally calm, but I saw the muscle in his jaw tighten, a sure sign of his anger. "Son," he said, his voice low and steady, "when your mother and I die, everything we have will be yours. But while we're alive, our decisions are our own." "This is our home. Don't be stubborn," Henry cut in, with a harshness I had never heard from him before. The mask of the concerned son was slipping. "You're old now. You can't keep living in the past. Living in the past." To them, our love, our memories, our entire life together was just the past, a dusty old book to be discarded. That night, after they left with stiff goodbyes and cold kisses on my cheek, Ernest and I stayed up talking until the sky began to lighten from black to deep blue. For the first time in our long marriage, we gave voice to a fear so dark we had only ever whispered around its edges. "Something's wrong, Margot," Ernest said, his face etched with a worry I had never seen before. He was sitting in his armchair, looking older and more tired than I had ever seen him. "This isn't just ambition. This isn't just impatience. There's something darker behind all this pressure. The way they look at us, it's not like sons looking at their parents. It's like bankers looking at a bad investment." I had felt it too, that chilling shift. But hearing him say it out loud made it real. "What do you think it is?" I asked, my voice small and scared. He shook his head, his gaze distant. "I don't know, but I don't like it. Henry asking me all those questions about my routine, what I eat for breakfast. Charles so obsessed with the insurance papers. It feels like they're gathering information. For what? I can't say." I remember reaching for his hand, his rough, familiar hand, and holding it tight. "There are boys, Ernest. They wouldn't. They couldn't." But my words sounded hollow, even to my own ears. The maternal love that had always blinded me was finally beginning to clear, and the view was terrifying. I had no idea, not even in my worst nightmares, how profoundly correct his words were. I couldn't imagine that my own flesh and blood were actively planning something that would shatter our lives forever. I didn't know that the tragedy that was coming wouldn't be a twist of fate, but a conspiracy carefully orchestrated by the two people I was supposed to trust most in the world. The last normal conversation I had with Charles was 3 weeks before Ernest's death. He came alone, without Jasmine, and he looked more serious than usual, almost pensive. "Mom," he said, sitting at the kitchen table where he had eaten so many breakfasts as a boy, "I want you to know that no matter what happens, Henry and I will always take care of you." At the time, his words had soothed me. A tiny flame of hope had flickered in my chest. "See," I told myself, "they do care. They're just awkward about showing it." But now, remembering those words beside Ernest's grave, they sent a shiver of pure ice down my spine. No matter what happens. Why did he say that? What did he know was going to happen? Was it a promise? Or was it a threat? The pressure to sell the house became a constant drumbeat in the background of our lives. They would call, their voices a mixture of faux concern and thinly veiled insistence. "We found a great little apartment, Mom, just 1 bedroom, easy to maintain." Or, "The market is perfect right now. If we wait, the value could drop." Ernest, bless him, held the line. He was a rock. "This is our home," he would repeat, his voice firm. "We are not leaving." I began to notice other things, small things that I'd previously dismissed. Ernest seemed more withdrawn in those final weeks. He'd spend long hours in his shop, not working, just sitting. I'd find him staring at old photographs of the boys when they were small, a deep, unreadable sadness in his eyes. One evening, I asked him what was wrong. He looked at me, and for a moment, the full weight of his fear was visible. "They brought me more papers to sign, Margot." Henry did. He said they were for modernizing the shop, getting new insurance for the equipment, but the language, it was complicated. Legalese. I didn't understand half of it. I asked him to explain, and he got impatient, told me just to sign, that it was for my own good. "Did you sign?" I asked, my heart in my throat. He shook his head. "No." I told him I needed to show it to you. First, he wasn't happy about that. He said there was no time, that the offer was expiring. He ran a hand over his face. Why all the hurry? Margot, what is this terrible hurry? The hurry, that was the key. They were always in a hurry. A hurry for us to sell, a hurry for us to retire, a hurry for us to sign papers we didn't understand. It was as if they were racing against a clock only they could see. The day before the accident, Ernest had come home from the bank. He looked troubled. Charles took me to the bank today, he said. He said it was time to update our signatures, that it would make things easier for you if something happened to me. If something happened to me. The phrase hung in the air between us. He helped me fill out some withdrawal slips, Ernest continued. For repairs at the shop, he said. But Margot, I didn't need thousands of dollars for repairs. Everything is in good working order. A cold dread began to coil in my stomach. How much, Ernest? He told me. The numbers made me feel faint. It was most of our life's savings. But you didn't sign, did you? I pleaded. He looked ashamed. He was so insistent. He said it was for a surprise for you, a birthday surprise. He said I couldn't tell you. He made it sound so exciting. A surprise. The word tasted like ash in my mouth now. What kind of surprise involved secretly draining our bank account? That night, we didn't talk much. We just sat together on the porch, holding hands, watching the stars appear one by one. It was our last normal night, our last quiet moment of peace. I didn't know it then, but the cracks I had been trying to ignore were about to rupture, swallowing my whole world into the darkness that had been waiting on the other side all along. The stage was set. The players were in position. And the final, terrible act was about to begin. The accident that shattered my world happened on a Tuesday morning. A Tuesday, just like the one all those years ago when Ernest had first stepped out of his shop and into my life. The irony of that was a bitter pill I would only choke on later. That morning had begun with such ordinary grace. The sun had streamed through our kitchen window, painting a bright, hopeful rectangle on the worn linoleum floor. I was at the counter, humming softly to myself, preparing Ernest's favorite lunch meatloaf with a sweet ketchup glaze and creamy mashed potatoes made with real butter and a splash of the milk from the Henderson's farm down the road. The familiar, comforting smells of onion and garlic sautéing filled the small room. Ernest had left at his usual time, just as the sun was cresting the old maple tree at the end of our street. I'd handed him his metal lunch pail, our fingers brushing, and he'd leaned in to kiss my cheek. "Don't work too hard, my love," I'd said, the same words I'd said nearly every morning for 42 years. He'd given me that smile, the one that still, after all this time, made my heart feel light. No promises, Margot. That old Raleigh isn't going to fix itself. I watched him walk down the path, his shoulders straight, his step still purposeful. He was wearing his old blue work shirt, the one with the faint, permanent stain on, the pocket from a pen that had leaked years ago. I stood at the screen door for a moment, watching him go, feeling that familiar, warm contentment that came from a life built on steadfast love. I had no premonition, no chill of foreboding. It was just another Tuesday. I turned back to my cooking, lost in the simple, rhythmic tasks. I was just sliding the meatloaf into the oven when the phone rang. The sound was jarring, an abrupt slash through the domestic quiet. It wasn't its ring that was unusual, but its character. It seemed to shriek with an urgency that made my hand freeze on the oven dial. No one called at this hour. My first, foolish thought was that Charles or Henry had forgotten something, or perhaps Ernest was calling to ask me to bring a specific tool he'd left behind. I wiped my hands on my apron and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, clipped, and professional. "Mrs. Hayes?" "Yes, speaking. This is Memorial Hospital. Your husband, Ernest Hayes, has been in a serious accident. You need to come immediately." The words didn't make sense. They were like a foreign language, syllables that held no meaning. Accident, hospital, immediately. They swirled in my head, disjointed and terrifying. The world seemed to slow, the bright rectangle of sunlight on the floor, tilting and swimming before my eyes. "What?" I managed to whisper, my throat tight. "What happened? Is he okay? Is he alive?" "Ma'am, please, you need to come to the hospital as soon as possible. The intensive care unit. Ask for Dr. Patterson." The line went dead. I stood there, the receiver clutched in my hand, a dull dial tone buzzing in my ear. Intensive care unit. Those words finally penetrated the fog. My legs gave way, and I had to grab the edge of the counter to keep from collapsing. The room spun. Ernest, my Ernest, in the ICU, a serious accident. I don't remember calling Doris. I must have, because the next thing I knew, her car was screeching to a halt in front of our house, and she was rushing in, her face pale with alarm. I was still standing in the same spot, my apron covered in flour, my hands shaking uncontrollably. "Margot, my God, what's wrong?" "The hospital," I choked out. "Ernest, accident." She didn't ask questions. She just took my arm, guided me out the door, and into her car. The drive to the hospital was a hazy, nightmarish blur. The world outside the window looked surreal, like a film playing at the wrong speed. I couldn't form a coherent thought. My mind was a screaming void of pure panic. He's careful, he's so careful. He knows every machine in that shop like the back of his hand. How could this have happened? When we arrived, rushing through the automatic doors into the sterile, antiseptic-smelling air of the hospital, I was met with a sight that, in my desperation, I found reassuring. Charles and Henry were already there, standing in the waiting area outside the ICU. They looked grave, their faces etched with what I took to be concern. "Mom," Charles said, stepping forward and pulling me into a hug. His embrace was tight, almost crushing. At the time, I thought it was the strength of his emotion. "It's bad, Mom. The doctors say one of the machines at the shop exploded. He has severe burns and a traumatic brain injury." Henry stood slightly behind him, his eyes red-rimmed. But even then, through the veil of my own terror, I noticed something. He seemed more nervous than sad. His gaze darted around the hallway, his fingers fidgeting with the car keys in his hand. He looked like a man waiting for important news, not a son grieving his father's potential death. "Can we see him?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I need to see him." A nurse approached, her expression professionally neutral. "Only immediate family, one at a time, and for 5 minutes maximum. He's in a critical condition." "You go, Mom," Charles said, his hand on my back, guiding me toward the door. Walking into that ICU room was like stepping into another colder dimension. The air was filled with the rhythmic, artificial sounds of machines' beeps and hisses that were the only signs of life. And there he was. My strong, vibrant Ernest, reduced to a still, broken form in the center of a white bed. He was hooked up to a dozen tubes and wires. Bandages covered most of his face and arms. I barely recognized him. His breathing was labored, a mechanical rasp pushed in and out of his lungs by a ventilator. A sob caught in my throat. I moved to his side on unsteady legs, my eyes fixed on his face, searching for some sign of the man I loved beneath the swelling and the gauze. I reached for his hand, the only part of him that seemed relatively untouched. It was cool and still. "Ernest," I whispered, my voice breaking. "My love, I'm here. I'm right here. Everything is going to be all right. You're going to recover. You have to. You're a fighter. You've always been a fighter." I poured all my love, all my will, into that touch, begging him to feel me, to hear me. And then, a miracle, a slight, almost imperceptible squeeze. His fingers tightened around mine with a ghost of their former strength. His eyelids fluttered behind their closed lids. He was fighting. My warrior was still in there, fighting to come back to me. He squeezed my hand. I cried out, turning to the nurse who had followed me in. "He's reacting." She gave me a look of practiced pity. "Sometimes there are involuntary muscle spasms, ma'am. It doesn't necessarily mean he's conscious." But I knew what I had felt. It wasn't a spasm, it was a response. It was him, he had heard me. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I became a ghost in that hospital, a creature of the waiting room's uncomfortable plastic chairs and the bitter, endless coffee from the vending machine. I barely slept, barely ate. My entire world had shrunk to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor in his room. Charles and Henry took turns staying with me, but their presence was a strange comfort. They always seemed more interested in talking to the doctors, in having hushed, serious conversations at the nurse's station, than in sitting with me, holding my hand, or simply sharing the silent weight of our vigil. I began to overhear fragments of their conversations, pieces that felt jarringly out of place. I passed by a consultation room and saw Henry inside, speaking with a man in a suit. "So the workers' comp policy would cover up to $75,000, you're sure?" Henry asked, his voice low. Another time, I heard Charles on his phone in the hallway, his back to me. "The life insurance is $50,000. The beneficiary is still Mom, of course, but we need to get the claim process started. Time is of the essence." Why were they talking about money? Why now, when their father's life hung by the thinnest of threads? It felt like they were measuring his life in dollar signs, calculating the financial yield of his death while he was still breathing. On the second day, Charles sat beside me, his expression somber. "Mom," he began, "we reviewed Dad's insurance policies. He has a life insurance policy for $50,000. There's also a workers' comp policy that could cover up to $75,000 more." I stared at him, a cold anger cutting through my grief. "I don't care about the money, Charles," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I just want your father to get better." "Of course, Mom," he said quickly, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. A coldness, a calculation. It was as if I were watching a banker assess a ledger, not a son worry for his father. On the third day, Dr. Patterson, an older man with kind, tired eyes, gathered us in a small, stark office. "Charles, Henry," and I sat facing him. I clutched my purse in my lap like a lifeline. "Mrs. Hayes." Dr. Patterson began softly, his gaze sympathetic. "Your husband's condition is critical. The burns have become infected, and the head trauma is more severe than we initially thought. We have to be realistic about his chances." "What does that mean?" I asked, though a part of me already knew. I could feel the answer, like a physical blow, waiting to land. "It means we need to prepare for the worst. Your husband is in an induced coma. We could keep him alive on life support indefinitely, but his quality of life, well, it's highly unlikely he will ever regain consciousness." No. The word screamed in my mind. No, no, no. This couldn't be happening. 42 years, a lifetime. And now they were telling me it was all fading away, like smoke. "We want to try everything," I said, my voice thick with sobs. "No matter the cost, no matter how long it takes, we have to try." But then I saw it. Charles and Henry exchanged a look. A quick, silent communication that sent a deep chill through me. It wasn't a look of shared grief. It was a look of agreement, of impatience. "Mom," Charles said, turning to me with a voice that tried to sound understanding but landed as condescending. "We have to be practical. Dad wouldn't want to live like this. He always said he never wanted to be a burden on anyone. A burden. The word ignited a fury in me I didn't know I possessed. He's your father, I exploded, my voice shaking with rage. He is not a burden. He's the man who raised you, who worked his whole life to give you the best he could. How can you say that? We know, Mom, Henry chimed in, his tone placating. But we also have to think about you. The medical bills are going to be enormous. They could wipe out all your savings. Again, money. Always money. My husband was dying, and they were calculating the cost. The pieces were there, right in front of me, but my grief was so all-consuming that I couldn't assemble them into the horrifying picture they formed. That night, I convinced the nurses to let me stay alone with him for a while. The room was dark, lit only by the ghostly glow of the monitors. I took his still hand in mine, the one that had squeezed mine just days before. "My love," I whispered, my tears falling onto the starched white sheet. "I don't know what to do. The doctors say there's no hope, but I can't let you go. I can't imagine my life without you. Please, Ernest, give me a sign, tell me what to do." And then, it happened again. Something that, to this day, gives me goosebumps. His fingers moved. A deliberate, faint pressure against my palm. His lips parted slightly, trembling, as if he were trying to form a word, to push sound past the tube in his throat. No sound came out, but the effort was there. He was fighting. He was trying to tell me something. I called for the nurses, desperate, hopeful. He's trying to talk. He's reacting. But by the time they arrived, he had slumped back into the profound stillness of the coma. The nurse checked the monitors and shook her head. "As I said before, Mrs. Hayes, these can be involuntary. The brain can fire signals, even in a comatose state. I'm so sorry. They thought I was a desperate wife seeing what she wanted to see. But I knew. I knew what I had felt. Ernest had tried to communicate with me. He had fought with the last of his strength to send me a message. I just didn't know how to decipher it. 2 days later, in the deep, dark hours of Friday morning, the frantic, high-pitched shriek of machine alarms tore through the quiet of the ICU. Lights flashed. Nurses and doctors rushed into his room in a blur of blue scrubs and urgent voices. I was dozing fitfully in a chair in the hallway, and the noise jolted me awake. "No. No, no, no," I screamed, scrambling to my feet and running toward the room. They wouldn't let me in. I stood at the door, watching through the small window as a team of medical professionals worked on his lifeless body, performing CPR, injecting medicines, their movements swift and desperate. It felt like an eternity, but it was only 40 minutes. Finally, the head doctor stopped, looked at the clock on the wall, and said something to the team. They all stepped back. The frantic activity ceased. The silence that followed was more deafening than the alarms. The doctor walked out, his shoulders slumped. He didn't need to say anything. The look on his face said it all. Time of death, 4:37 a.m. The pain was physical, a searing, white-hot agony that felt like my soul was being ripped from my body. I collapsed against the wall, a raw, animalistic wail tearing from my throat. My Ernest was gone. The fight was over. He was gone. An hour later, Charles and Henry arrived. They were dressed, composed, and they carried briefcases. They seemed prepared, as if they had been expecting this call, waiting for it. They had papers with them, documents and phone numbers for funeral homes. "We already talked to the Spring Creek Funeral Home," Charles said to me while I was still sobbing, lost in a bottomless ocean of grief. "They can pick up the body this morning." "We also contacted the insurance company," Henry added, not even looking at me. "The claim process is already underway." Their efficiency was chilling. Their coldness, just an hour after losing their father, was unnatural. Something was terribly wrong. But my grief was a tidal wave, and it drowned out all other thoughts, all other suspicions. I was simply too broken to see the truth that was staring me right in the face. The agony of his loss was the only thing that was real. Little did I know, the real nightmare was only just beginning. The silence in the house was no longer just the absence of sound. It was a presence, a heavy, listening entity that seemed to feed on my fear and uncertainty. The bank statements lay on the kitchen table, a neat, damning pile of paper that screamed of betrayal. $8,000 gone, and Charles's fingerprints were all over it. The message about the insurance being a trap had completed a circuit in my mind. Greed wasn't just a character flaw in my sons, it was a motive. A powerful, terrifying motive, but I needed more. The financial deception was one thing, but it was circumstantial. It pointed to a desire for money, but not necessarily to murder. I had to know what happened in that shop. I had to face the place where my husband had drawn his last conscious breath. The message had told me, "Go to Ernest's shop. Look in his desk. There are things you didn't see." For days, I found excuses not to go. The grief was still a physical weight, making every movement an effort. The fear was a cold, sharp thing lodged under my ribs. What if I found something that confirmed my worst suspicions? What if I found nothing at all, proving that I was indeed spiraling into the paranoia my sons would soon accuse me of? But the not knowing was worse. It was a constant, gnawing anxiety that poisoned every memory, every moment of quiet. Finally, on a gray, overcast morning that matched the desolation inside me, I ran out of excuses. I took the old key from the hook by the back door, the key to the shop that Ernest had always left there, a symbol of his open, trusting nature. It felt cold and heavy in my hand. I walked down the familiar path from our house to the small detached building at the back of our property. Hayes & Son Bicycle Repair was still painted in slightly faded letters on the window. The and son part had always been a declaration of hope, a dream of legacy. Now, it felt like a cruel joke. My hand trembled as I slid the key into the lock. The click was loud in the quiet morning. I pushed the door open, and the smell hit me first, the familiar, comforting scent of grease, rubber, and old wood. It was the smell of Ernest. It was so powerfully him that for a moment my knees buckled, and I had to lean against the doorframe, tears springing to my eyes. I half expected to hear his voice, to see him look up from a bike frame, his face smudged with oil, a warm smile of welcome. But the shop was silent, and it was clean. That was the second thing that struck me. It was too clean. Charles had said a machine had exploded. He described a violent, catastrophic accident that had caused severe burns and a traumatic brain injury. I had envisioned chaos: overturned tool chests, shrapnel embedded in the walls, soot staining the ceiling, the acrid smell of smoke still lingering in the air. But there was none of that. The shop was tidy, almost unnervingly so. The tools hung in their designated places on the pegboard, outlined in Ernest's meticulous hand. The workbenches were clear of clutter. The concrete floor was swept. There were no burn marks scarring the walls, no shattered glass, no signs of the destructive force that should have torn through this small space. A cold dread, different from the ache of grief, began to creep up my spine. "Where is the machine that exploded?" I whispered into the stillness. I walked further in, my eyes scanning every corner. The welder sat in its spot, its nozzle clean. The air compressor was silent, its tank full. The electric saw was unplugged, its blade dust-free. Every machine was in its place, intact, seemingly operational. Nothing was out of place, nothing was damaged. This wasn't the scene of an industrial accident, this was the scene of a lie. My heart began to beat a frantic, panicked rhythm. If there was no explosion, then how had Ernest been so terribly injured? The hospital had spoken of severe burns. But there was no evidence of fire here, nothing. The story Charles had told, the story we had all believed, was false. Deliberately false. My gaze fell upon Ernest's old, battered wooden desk, tucked into the far corner. It was where he did his paperwork, sketched out designs, and drank his morning coffee. "Look in his desk," the message had said. I moved toward it as if in a trance, my feet carrying me across the familiar floor. The desk was as tidy as the rest of the shop. A blotter, a cup holding pens and pencils, a stack of invoices. It looked so normal. But Ernest was a man of habit. He had his hiding places, little spots he thought were clever. One was a false bottom in the top drawer, a secret compartment he'd shown me years ago, jokingly, saying it was where he kept his treasure. At the time, it had held a $5 bill and a love note I'd written him. I'd laughed and forgotten about it. Now, my hands trembling, I pulled open the top drawer. I emptied it carefully, setting the contents on the desk. I felt along the bottom of the drawer, my fingers searching for the nearly imperceptible seam. There it was. I pressed on one corner, and a small section of the wood lifted away, revealing the hidden compartment. Inside, there were no love notes. There was a small, folded stack of papers. I lifted them out, my breath catching in my throat. The top sheet was a note, written in Ernest's familiar, firm handwriting. The date at the top was 3 days before his death. "Charles insists I need more insurance. He says it's for Margot, to protect her if something happens to me. But something doesn't feel right. He's so pushy about it. His eyes get that hard look he gets when he's closing a business deal. I don't trust his intentions." I sank into Ernest's chair, the wood groaning under my weight. My vision swam. He had known. He had felt it too. The pressure, the ulterior motive. He had seen the same cold calculation in our son's eyes that I was only now beginning to see. Beneath that note was another. "Henry brought me some papers to sign today. He says they're to modernize the shop, get new liability coverage." But the language was thick, complicated. I told him I needed to read it properly, to show you. He got angry, impatient, said I was being stubborn, that it was a time-sensitive offer. Why all the hurry? What is this terrible hurry? The hurry. It was the same question we had asked each other on the porch. The same relentless, inexplicable rush. They were hurting him, pressuring him, trying to get him to sign things he didn't understand, to make financial decisions that didn't make sense. They were setting the stage, and Ernest, my clever, cautious Ernest, had sensed the trap closing around him. Tears streamed down my face, hot and bitter. He had been alone in this. He had carried this fear, this suspicion of his own children, and he had tried to protect me from it. He had left me a trail of breadcrumbs, and then I saw it. At the very bottom of the compartment was a sealed white envelope, and on the front, written in his hand, was a single word, Margot. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely tear the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter. I unfolded it, and his voice seemed to fill the quiet shop, speaking to me from beyond the grave. "My dearest Margot, if you are reading this, it means something has happened to me. In recent months, I've noticed strange changes in Charles and Henry. They're too interested in our money, in the insurance, in us selling the house. Jasmine is putting a lot of pressure on them. I can feel it. Yesterday, Charles told me I should be more concerned about my safety because at my age, any accident could be fatal. I don't know why, Margot, but those words sounded like a threat. They felt like a warning of what was to come. I love you more than anything in this world. I have loved you since I saw you walking to the market in that faded green dress. If something happens to me, don't trust anyone blindly, not even our sons. All my love, forever your Ernest. The letter fluttered from my numb fingers onto the desk. I buried my face in my hands and a wail of pure, unadulterated agony tore from my throat. It was a sound of grief, of rage, of betrayal so profound it felt like my soul was being shredded. He had known. He had written this letter sensing his own murder. He had seen the signs that I, blinded by a mother's love, had desperately tried to explain away. The words echoed in the silent shop. Any accident could be fatal. It wasn't concern, it was a blueprint. A prediction they made sure came true. I sat there for a long time, sobbing in the chair that still held the shape of his body, surrounded by the tools of his trade, in the place he had loved most. The ghost of my husband was in this room, not as a frightening specter, but as a guide. He had left me the truth. He had armed me with his suspicions, his fears, his love. The grief was still there, a vast, dark ocean. But now, a new emotion was rising from its depths, cold and hard and sharp, resolve. I was no longer a passive victim of tragedy. I was a soldier in a war my husband had seen coming. He had handed me the weapons, his notes, his letter, the evidence of the lie about the explosion. The message was real. Ernest may not have been physically alive, but his spirit, his truth, was fighting back. And he was fighting through me. I carefully folded the letter and the notes, placing them in my purse alongside the bank statements. This was my evidence. This was my why. I locked the shop door behind me, the key feeling different in my hand now. It was no longer a key to a place of memory. It was a key to a crime scene. The pieces were coming together, forming a picture of such calculated evil that it was almost impossible to comprehend. My sons hadn't just been greedy. They had systematically manipulated, pressured, and threatened their father, and then they had killed him. And they had done it all while looking me in the eye, calling me Mom. The war was no longer a vague concept. It was here. And I was ready to fight. The evidence felt like a live wire in my purse, humming with a dangerous energy. Ernest's letter, his notes, the bank statements, they were no longer just papers. They were shields and weapons, the armor I had desperately needed. The grief was still a vast, cold sea inside me, but now an island of furious resolve had risen from its depths. I was no longer drowning. I was preparing for battle. I knew they would come. The pressure to sell the house, to manage my money, to shuffle me off to a community, it had been a constant drumbeat before Ernest's death. Now, with him gone, I was the only remaining obstacle between them and everything they wanted. They wouldn't wait long. The message had warned me, and Ernest's letter had confirmed it. I was in danger, not just from their greed, but from their impatience. I spent the day after my discovery in the shop in a state of heightened alert. Every creak of the old house made me jump. Every car that slowed on the street outside sent my heart into a frantic rhythm. I moved Ernest's letter from my purse to a sealed envelope, which I tucked inside my favorite recipe book, The Joy of Cooking. It was the last place anyone would look for a confession. The bank statements and his notes I kept with me, a constant, grim reminder of what I was facing. It was Charles who came first. He arrived that evening, just as the long summer twilight was beginning to bleed into darkness. He didn't call ahead. He never did any more. He simply appeared, a bottle of expensive red wine in one hand and that polished, professional smile on his face. The smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mom," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. His skin was cool and smooth. "I thought you could use some company. And a decent glass of wine." He moved through my kitchen with a sense of ownership, taking down 2 glasses from the cupboard without asking, uncorking the bottle with a practiced twist. He poured a generous amount for himself and a smaller one for me, pushing it. across the table toward me. I looked at the deep red liquid, remembering the message's warning. Don't take anything they offer you to eat or drink. Was I being paranoid, or was I being smart? I decided on the latter. I left the glass untouched. Thank you, Charles, I said, my voice carefully neutral. That's thoughtful. He sat down, sipping his wine, his eyes scanning the room. I could almost see the calculations going on behind them, appraising the value of the cabinets, the old stove, the square footage. I've been thinking about your future, Mom. He began, his tone conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. The insurance money, it's already in process. It'll be $15,000 total. A nice little nest egg. The figure was so specific, so certain. How do you know the exact amount? I asked, feigning a mild, grandmotherly curiosity. I thought these things took time to process. He waved a dismissive hand. I helped Dad with the insurance paperwork. He wanted to make sure you had enough to live comfortably after he was gone. He was always thinking of you. A lie. A smooth, easy lie delivered with a sip of wine. According to Ernest's own note, he had been pressured, his suspicions aroused. The insurance wasn't his idea, it was theirs. And what do you think I should do with that money? I asked, watching him closely. I was playing a part now, the confused, elderly widow, and I had to do it perfectly. His eyes lit up with a familiar glint, the one I now recognized as unvarnished greed. It sent a chill straight through me. Well, he said, leaning forward, his voice taking on a confidential tone. You have options. You could buy a smaller, cozier house. Or, even better, move into a nice retirement community where you'd have company and medical care. Henry and I could manage the money for you, of course, invest it. We could triple that amount in a few years. Manage my money. The phrase was a key turning in a lock. They didn't want me to have a nest egg. They wanted to control it, to manage it until it disappeared into their own debts and desires. Triple it? More likely, they would triple their own bank accounts while I was left with nothing in some sterile room, forgotten. Let me think about it, I said, my voice soft, trying to sound overwhelmed. I needed to buy time. I needed to understand the full scope of their plan. Of course, he said, but his smile tightened at the edges. Take your time, but not too long. For your own good. For your own good. The most sinister phrase in the English language when spoken by someone with malicious intent. It meant, do what we say, or else. After he left, the silence felt more threatening than before. The untouched glass of wine sat on the table like a symbol of my newfound defiance. I poured it down the sink, watching the red liquid swirl away, taking with it any last vestige of doubt. My son had sat in my kitchen and calmly laid out a plan to rob me. He had looked me in the eye and lied about his father's intentions. The next day, Henry arrived. He came with a bouquet of flowers, expensive, scentless lilies that looked more like a funeral arrangement than a gift. His performance was different from Charles's. Where Charles was the slick businessman, Henry was the concerned, slightly exasperated son. "How are you, Mom?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over me with a clinical assessment. "You look tired." "I'm fine," I lied, the words becoming a mantra. "I'm just thinking about the future." "That's good." He arranged the flowers in a vase with clumsy hands. "Charles and I have been talking. We think you should sell the house soon, while the memory of Dad is fresh on the real estate market. It could be a selling point." The cynicism of it took my breath away. They were going to use their murdered father's memory to sell the house he loved. "Why the rush?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Well, old houses lose value quickly," he said, not meeting my eyes. "And you need liquidity. There are funeral expenses pending medical bills." More lies. The funeral had been cheap, rushed. And the hospital bills. Charles had been so proud of the insurance covering everything. They were tripping over their own fabrications. I decided to test the waters, to see how deep the lies went. I looked him directly in the eyes, my own gaze steady. "Henry," I said, my voice dropping, "you knew your dad didn't die from a work accident." For a fraction of a second, pure, unadulterated panic flashed across his face. It was there and gone so quickly I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching for it. But I saw it. The rabbit in the headlights look of a guilty man caught off guard. He recovered quickly, a mask of confused concern sliding back into place. "What are you talking about, Mom?" "I went to the police station," I said calmly. "There's no report of an explosion at Dad's shop." Sergeant O'Connell was very clear. No report at all. This time, the panic was more evident. His eyes widened, and his jaw tightened. "Mom, you shouldn't be doing things like that. Going to the police? They'll just confuse you. The grief, it's getting to you. You're not thinking clearly. The grief is getting to me. The first shot across the bow in their campaign to discredit me. To paint me as a hysterical, confused old woman. The grief is getting to me," I repeated, my voice flat, "or you've been lying to me." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. He knocked over his coffee cup, the brown liquid spreading like a stain across the table. "I think you need to rest," he said, his voice tight. "We'll talk when you're calmer." He left quickly, almost fleeing. But not before I saw him pull out his phone on my front porch, making a call, his body language urgent and agitated. I didn't need to hear the words. I knew he was calling Charles. The plan was unraveling, and I was the one pulling the thread. That promorator. Night, my phone vibrated with a new message. It was longer than the others, a detailed prediction. "They're coming together tomorrow. They're going to try to convince you that you're crazy, that grief is making you imagine things. Don't believe them. And don't take anything they offer you to eat or drink." The message was a chess master predicting the opponent's moves. It was both terrifying and empowering. They weren't just greedy, they were predictable. Their playbook was one of gaslighting and manipulation, and I now had a copy of it. The next day, just as the message foretold, they arrived together, Charles, Henry, and Jasmine, a united front. They descended upon my house with expressions of exaggerated, theatrical concern. Jasmine was carrying a bag of pastries from the expensive downtown bakery. "Mom, we're so worried about you," Charles began, his voice dripping with a syrupy false sincerity. "The neighbors have told us you've been acting strange. Doris says you've been talking to yourself, that you aren't eating well." Another lie, Doris would never say that. She was my rock. "Jasmine brought your favorite pastries," Henry added, his smile strained. "And we made special coffee from that brand you like so much." They had brought reinforcements and props. The pastries, the coffee, all potential vehicles for whatever they had planned. I remembered the message's warning and Ernest's letter. Any accident could be fatal. Was that their plan for me? A little something in my coffee? An accidental overdose of my heart medication? A fall down the stairs in my confused state? "Thank you, but I already had breakfast," I said, keeping my distance, my voice firm. "But Mom," Jasmine insisted, her smile not reaching her cold eyes, "you need to eat properly. You've lost so much weight since Dad died." "I'm fine," I repeated, the words a shield. Charles exchanged a significant look with Henry. It was the same look they had shared in the hospital when the doctor gave us Ernest's prognosis, a look of cold conspiracy. "Mom," Charles said, moving to sit closer to me, invading my space, "we want to talk to you about something important. Henry and I have been consulting with some doctors about your recent behavior." My behavior. The trap was springing shut. Yes, I said, playing my part. What about my behavior? The strange questions you've been asking. Henry chimed in, his face a mask of grave concern. The visits to the police station, that obsession with irrelevant details about Dad's accident. It's normal after a great loss, but it can be dangerous if it's not treated. Treated? I asked, my heart hammering. Treated for what? We spoke to Dr. Albright, Charles said, referring to Jasmine's uncle, a psychiatrist in the city. He says it's common for older people to develop paranoia after losing a partner. Especially women your age. Paranoia, they were accusing me of being crazy for uncovering their lies. The audacity was breathtaking. I am not paranoid, I said, my voice low and steady, all pretense of confusion gone. I am just asking questions I should have asked from the beginning. What questions? Charles challenged, his eyes narrowing. Like why there's no police report for your father's supposed accident. Like why the shop is perfectly clean if there was an explosion. Like why you withdrew $8,000 from our bank account without my knowledge. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The three of them stared at me, their masks of concern cracking to reveal the sheer, naked panic beneath. They had not expected this. They had not expected me to fight back. Mom, Henry finally spluttered, those things have simple explanations. But I cut him off. Don't, I said, my voice like ice. Don't insult me with more lies. Charles stood up, his face hardening. The concerned son was gone, replaced by the ruthless businessman. All right. If you won't listen to reason, we'll have to take more drastic measures. What does that mean? I asked, though I already knew. It means we can start a legal process to have you declared mentally incompetent, he said, his voice cold and flat. We have witnesses to your erratic behavior. We have a preliminary report from Dr. Albright confirming you suffer from senile paranoia. A doctor who had never met me, bought and paid for with their dirty money. So, you can cooperate voluntarily. Charles continued, a predator moving in for the kill. Or, we can do it legally. But either way, you're going to get the help you need. It was a direct threat, a declaration of war. If I didn't hand over my money and my freedom willingly, they would use the legal system to steal it from me and lock me away. I looked at the three of them, standing in my kitchen, the kitchen where I had fed them, loved them, raised them. I saw not my children, but serpents I had nursed at my own breast. I need time to think about it, I told them, my voice trembling not with fear, but with a rage so pure it felt holy. Of course, Jasmine said with her false sweetness. But not too much time. For your own good. After they left, I didn't collapse. I didn't cry. I stood in the center of my kitchen, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, shaking with a fury that felt like it could power the whole town. They had shown their hand. They had murdered their father for money, and now they were planning to bury me alive, to steal everything I had left. But they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated their mother. They thought I was a weak, grieving old woman. They didn't know that Ernest had armed me with the truth. They didn't know that I was now the most dangerous creature on earth, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The serpents had visited, and they had left their venom behind. But I was building an immunity. The confrontation had left the air in my house charged, as if a storm had passed through and left behind the metallic scent of ozone and imminent lightning. Their threat hung in the room, a palpable poison, mentally incompetent. The words were a legalistic cage, designed to shut me away, to silence me forever. They thought they had me cornered. They thought the grieving, confused old woman would capitulate, too frail to fight the machine of their lies and bought-off professionals. but they had miscalculated. The woman they threatened was not the same woman who had wept at her husband's graveside. That woman had been shattered, yes, but the pieces had been reforged in the fire of betrayal into something harder, sharper. Ernest's letter was my compass, the mysterious messages my map. I could not, would not, let them win. The message had been clear. Tomorrow, go to the police station. Ask for the report on Ernest's accident. There are contradictions you need to know about. I didn't wait for tomorrow. I went that same afternoon, my purse clutched tightly, feeling the weight of the evidence within the bank statements. Ernest's notes, his final, heartbreaking letter. I walked into the Spring Creek police station, a small, brick building that housed more traffic tickets than major crimes. Sergeant Miles O'Connell was behind the front desk, a man who had known Ernest for 30 years. They'd shared coffee at the diner, talked about the town's goings-on. He was a solid, dependable man with a kind face now etched with lines of sympathy when he saw me. "Margot," he said, coming around the desk. "It's good to see you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. How are you holding up?" "I'm managing, Miles, thank you." I took a steadying breath. "I'm here about Ernest. I need to see the official report on his accident." His bushy gray eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "The report on your husband's accident?" he asked, his tone genuinely puzzled. "What accident, Margot?" A cold trickle of dread, colder than anything I had felt yet, began to trace its way down my spine. "From his shop," I said, my voice tighter now. "When the machine exploded." Sergeant O'Connell shook his head, a deep frown on his face. He turned to a filing cabinet behind the desk, its drawers labeled by year. He pulled one open, his fingers walking through the folders. He checked another. He then turned to his computer, tapping keys with a deliberate slowness that made my heart pound against my ribs like a frantic bird. "Mrs. Hayes," he said finally, looking up at me with those kind, confused eyes. "We don't have any report of an explosion at Ernest's shop here. In fact, we don't have any report of a work accident involving your husband at all. None." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The floor beneath my feet felt unstable. I had to grab the edge of the counter to steady myself. But my son said, he said it was an accident at the shop. That's why he was in the hospital. "Mrs. Hayes," the sergeant said gently, coming closer, his voice low. "Your husband was brought into the emergency room on Tuesday morning, that's correct. But not from a work accident." He paused, his eyes searching mine as if gauging my strength. "According to the medical report the hospital forwarded to us, he arrived unconscious with symptoms consistent with poisoning." The word hit me with the force of a physical blow. Poisoning. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a tragic, random accident. It was a deliberate, intimate act of violence. "Poisoning?" I whispered, the word tasting like ash and metal. "What kind of poisoning?" "The doctors found significant traces of methanol in his blood," Sergeant O'Connell explained, his voice grave. "It's a toxic alcohol. In the quantity present, it would cause dizziness, confusion, blindness, severe neurological damage, and eventually, well, it's often fatal. The symptoms can mimic a stroke or a heart attack, which is perhaps why." He trailed off, but I finished the thought in my head. "Which is perhaps why we were all so easily deceived." "Why didn't anyone tell me this?" I asked, my voice breaking, a fresh wave of horror washing over me. "The doctors, they never said a word about poison. They talked about burns, about a brain injury from an explosion." The sergeant's expression turned grim. "That's the other part of it, Margot. The immediate family who signed the hospital admission papers requested that the information about the suspected poisoning be kept confidential. They claimed you were too emotionally fragile to handle the technical details. They said it would only cause you unnecessary distress and speculation. The immediate family, Charles and Henry. They had been at the hospital before me. They had taken control. They had hidden the truth, invented a story about an explosion, and manipulated everyone, the doctors, the nurses, and most of all, me, to cover up a murder. They had looked into my eyes, seen my utter devastation, and fed me lies while their father lay dying from the poison they had likely administered. The full, monstrous reality of it crashed down upon me. This wasn't just greed. This was premeditated, cold-blooded murder. They hadn't just wished for their father's death for the insurance money. They had engineered it. They had chosen a method that was slow, that mimicked natural causes, that would arouse little suspicion. They had poisoned his food, or his drink, his coffee. Ernest loved his morning coffee. Henry has been asking strange questions about my daily routine, what I eat for breakfast. The note from his desk flashed in my mind. Mrs. Hayes, Sergeant O'Connell said, his voice pulling me back from the abyss. If you have reason to suspect the circumstances of your husband's death, we could open a formal investigation. But I have to be honest with you. Without new evidence, it would be difficult. The death certificate, as it stands, lists heart failure due to complications from a work accident. To challenge that, we'd need something concrete. I had more than suspicions. I had a mountain of evidence piling up in my purse and in my heart. The financial deception, the pressured insurance policies, the lie about the explosion, and now, the confirmed cause of death, poisoning. It was all pointing to one terrifying, inescapable conclusion. I have evidence, Miles, I said, my voice surprisingly steady now, forged in the certainty of this new, horrifying truth. I have bank statements showing large, unauthorized withdrawals my sons were involved in. I have notes from Ernest, written before he died, stating that he was suspicious of them, that he felt threatened. I have a letter he left for me, warning me not to trust them. Sergeant O'Connell's eyes widened. This was no longer the ramblings of a grieving widow. This was a credible allegation. Do you have these with you? He asked, his professional demeanor fully engaged. Not all of it, I said, but I can get them. And there's something else. I hesitated, unsure how to explain the messages. I've been receiving anonymous texts, someone warning me, telling me not to trust my sons, telling me to look for these very things. They knew about the insurance, the bank account, they knew about the poisoning. Anonymous texts? The sergeant's tone was cautious. Do you have the number? I showed him the message thread. He copied down the number. It's likely a burner phone, he mused. Untraceable. But the information, that's another matter. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of pity and grim determination. Margot, what you're suggesting, it's a very serious accusation. I know what I'm suggesting, I replied, looking him directly in the eye. My son's murdered. My husband for money. They poisoned him. And now they're planning to have me declared incompetent to get the rest. I am not confused, Miles. I am not paranoid. I am a woman who has uncovered a murder. The silence in the small police station was absolute. I could see the struggle on his face, the desire to believe a respected member of the community, the horror of the accusation, the weight of what pursuing it would mean for this quiet town. All right, he said finally, letting out a long breath. All right, bring me everything you have. The bank statements, the notes, the letter. We'll look into this, discreetly, for now. But Margot, you need to be prepared. If this is true, and we can prove it, there will be no going back. Your family, your life, it will never be the same. My family was murdered the day my sons decided to kill their father, I said, my voice cold and clear. My life ended when his did. All that's left now is the truth, and I will have it, no matter the cost. I left the police station walking on legs that felt both leaden and weightless. The world outside was the same blue sky, the same quiet street, but I was seeing it through new eyes. The poison was no longer just in Ernest's body. It was in the very fabric of my life, a toxic secret that had been spreading its roots for months. But now I had the antidote, the truth. It was a bitter, painful medicine, but it was the only thing that could save what was left of my soul. My sons were not just greedy, they were murderers, and I was going to make sure the whole world knew it. The truth was a shard of ice lodged in my heart, poisoning. The word echoed in the silent spaces of my mind, coloring every memory of those last terrible days in the hospital. The confusion the doctors had attributed to brain trauma, had that been the poison seizing his mind? The labored breathing, the loss of sight behind his swollen lids, had that been his body shutting down, cell by cell, betrayed by the very sustenance meant to give him life? The image of Charles or Henry, my own flesh and blood, calmly measuring out a lethal dose of methanol and stirring it into their father's morning coffee, was so monstrous, I could barely hold it in my head without feeling my sanity tremble. They hadn't just killed him, they had tortured him. They had watched him deteriorate, feigning concern while secretly counting the hours until the insurance money was theirs. Sergeant O'Connell's warning echoed in my ears. If this is true, there will be no going back. There was no going back from the moment I read that text at the graveside. There was only going forward, into the darkness, armed with nothing but the flickering torch of truth. The messages had been my guide, my unseen ally in this shadow war. And now, the final instruction had arrived, the one that promised answers, that promised a face to put to the number that had become my lifeline. Margot, this is Stephen Callahan, a private investigator. Ernest hired me 3 weeks before he died because he was suspicious of Charles and Henry. They poisoned him with methanol mixed in his breakfast coffee. I have audio evidence of their conversations, planning everything. Tomorrow at 3:00 the afternoon, go to the corner cafe. Sit at the back table, I'll be there. Stephen Callahan. A name, a real person. Ernest, in his wisdom, in his fear, had reached out. He hadn't just left me notes, he had hired a professional. The relief was so profound it was dizzying. I wasn't alone. My husband, even from beyond the grave, was fighting for me. The following day was the longest of my life. I moved through the morning in a fog of nervous anticipation. I dressed with care, choosing a serious purple dress, the one I saved for important occasions. I wanted to look strong, capable, worthy of the devastating truths I was about to hear. If I was going to meet the man who held the keys to this nightmare, I needed to be prepared. At 2:30, I walked to the corner cafe, a small, unassuming place with checkered tablecloths and the rich aroma of roasted coffee. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every person walking past could be a spy for my sons. The paranoia they had accused me of was now a necessary survival skill. I went straight to the back table, as instructed, a secluded booth shrouded in relative dimness. I ordered a chamomile tea, my hands trembling slightly as I wrapped them around the warm mug, seeking comfort where there was none to be found. At exactly 3:00, a man approached. He was in his late 50s, tall with a lean frame and a head of thick, silver-gray hair. He had intelligent, keen eyes that scanned the room before settling on me, and a serious, kind expression that put me slightly at ease. He carried a simple brown leather folder under his arm. "Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, his voice a low, calm baritone. I nodded, my throat too tight to form words. "I'm Stephen Callahan," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. He placed the folder on the table between us, a simple object that I knew contained the power to shatter my world all over again. I'm so sorry for your loss. Ernest was a good man, a very good man. Thank you, I managed to whisper. Your messages, they kept me from losing my mind. He made me promise, Stephen said, his gaze steady and direct. He said if anything happened to him, I was to make sure you knew the truth, that I was to protect you. He placed a hand on the folder. Before I show you what I have, I need you to know that what you're about to hear and see is going to be very, very painful. It's going to confirm your worst fears. Are you ready? I looked at the folder, then back into his eyes. I've been getting ready since I received your first message, I replied, a firmness in my voice that came from the very core of my being. I need to know. However painful it is, I need to know. Stephen gave a slow, grave nod. He opened the folder and took out a small, high-quality digital voice recorder. Ernest came to see me a month ago. He was deeply troubled by his son's behavior. He hired me to investigate them discreetly. He was afraid, but he didn't know what of. He just knew something was very wrong. He pressed the play button. And then, his voice, Ernest's voice, it filled the small space between us, so familiar, so dear, so alive. It was like a ghost had sat down at our table. A fresh wave of grief, sharp and sweet, washed over me. Stephen, I need you to know that if something happens to me, it won't be an accident. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of fear I had never heard in life. Charles and Henry have been pressuring me to increase my life insurance. Yesterday, Charles brought me papers, he said, were to better protect Margot. But when I read them, I realized there were also clauses that directly benefited them. The coverage jumped from 5,000 to 50. Why? Why such an increase? I closed my eyes, listening to my husband's suspicions, the very ones I had found scrawled in his notes, now given voice. It was both agonizing and vindicating. The recording continued. Henry has been asking strange questions about my daily routine, what I eat for breakfast, what time I leave the house, if Margot comes to the shop with me. He says it's out of concern, but something about the way he asks, it worries me. It feels like he's gathering information. For what, I can't say. Stephen paused the recording. This was 3 weeks before his death. But I have something more recent. His expression was grim. I placed listening devices, as per Ernest's instructions, in the house phone, in the living room. He played another recording. The quality was different, slightly muffled, but the voices were unmistakable. It was Charles, talking on the phone. No, we can't wait any longer. The old man is starting to get suspicious. Yesterday, he asked me why I was so interested in his insurance. A pause. Yes, I already have the methanol. It works perfectly because the symptoms look like a heart attack or a stroke. No, Mom won't be a problem. After Dad dies, she'll be so devastated that we can do whatever we want with her. Tears began to stream down my face, hot and silent. There it was. The voice of my firstborn son, my Charles, coldly, calmly discussing the murder of his father as if it were a business transaction. The word Mom on his lips felt like a desecration. There's more, Stephen said softly, his own voice thick with emotion. He fast-forwarded the recorder. This is from the day before Ernest's death. A new recording began. This time, it was Henry. Everything's ready. Tomorrow, Charles is going to put the methanol in Dad's coffee. We told him it was a special vitamin supplement a doctor recommended. The idiot is going to drink it without suspecting a thing. A cold, ugly laugh. The symptoms, it'll start with dizziness and confusion, then loss of sight, convulsions, coma. The doctors will think it's a stroke or a heart attack. By the time they realize it's poisoning, it'll be too late. My world, what was left of it, completely and utterly collapsed. I covered my mouth with my hand, stifling a sob. Not only had they planned it, but they had executed it with a clinical, mocking cruelty. They had called their father an idiot for trusting them. They had laughed about his impending death. How did you get these? I asked through my tears. As I said, Ernest authorized it. He was terrified. We placed the devices in strategic spots. He wanted a record, in case. Stephen didn't need to finish. He took out a series of photographs from the folder and slid them across the table. I also have this. Charles buying methanol at a hardware store, 30 miles from town. He paid with cash and used a fake name, but I have it on video stills. The photographs were grainy but clear. They showed Charles, dressed in casual clothes he never wore in Spring Creek, leaving a hardware store with a small, unlabeled brown bottle in his hand. The date stamp on the photos was 5 days before Ernest's death. And this, Stephen continued, showing me another set of documents. These are Charles and Henry's financial records from the last 6 months. They've been spending far beyond their means. Charles owes $70,000 to a loan shark in the city. Henry has gambling debts close to $40,000. They were desperate. They were drowning. It all made a horrifying, perfect sense. The pressure, the lies, the murder. It wasn't just greed, it was financial desperation. They saw their parents not as family, but as assets to be liquidated. Why didn't you go to the police immediately after Ernest's death? I asked, a hint of anger cutting through my grief. Because they were smart, Stephen explained. They bribed the attending physician at the hospital, a Dr. Evans, to falsify the death certificate. Instead of methanol poisoning, it says heart failure due to complications from a work accident. Without that medical evidence, my recordings might not have been enough for a conviction. They could have claimed they were just venting, joking. But now, he gestured to the folder. Now we have it all together. The motive, the means, the confession. And there's one more thing you need to know, Stephen said, his expression turning even more solemn. My blood ran cold. What? Your sons were planning to kill you, too. He played one last recording. Charles and Henry, together. Once we have Dad's insurance money, we need to get rid of Mom, too, Charles said, his voice matter of fact. We can't risk her getting suspicious or anyone else putting ideas in her head. How? Henry asked. The same as with Dad. But this time, we can make it look like a suicide from depression. A widow who can't live without her husband. Nobody would question it. And the money, we're her only heirs. Everything would be ours. The house, the savings, the insurance money, almost $200,000 in total. The recording stopped. I was shaking uncontrollably, a cold sweat breaking out all over my body. They had not only murdered their father, they had a plan to murder me. All for money. The sheer, unadulterated evil of it was beyond comprehension. Mrs. Hayes, Stephen said gently. I know this is devastating, but we have enough evidence to make them pay for what they did. What do we do now? I asked, wiping my tears with a trembling hand, the resolve hardening inside me once more. First, we go to the police with all of this. Sergeant O'Connell is an honest man. Second, we need to act fast. Your sons are planning to have you declared mentally incompetent tomorrow. If they succeed, it will be much harder to proceed legally. Tomorrow? A new fear, sharp and immediate, gripped me. Yes, I intercepted a phone conversation this morning. They're meeting with Judge Miller at 10 a.m. to start the process. I stood up from the table, a sudden, clear determination straightening my spine. Then we have to act tonight. Exactly, Stephen confirmed, gathering the evidence back into the folder. But first, there's one more thing I want to show you. He took one last photograph from the folder. It showed Ernest, looking healthy and alert, leaving a medical clinic I didn't recognize. 3 days before he died, your husband went to get a full medical exam at a clinic in the city. The results show that he was perfectly healthy. His heart was strong, his blood pressure was normal. There were no signs of any pre-existing conditions. This definitively proves that his death was caused by the poisoning, not by any natural health problems. That was the final piece, the unassailable truth. Ernest had been a healthy man, murdered in cold blood by his own sons. I reached across the table and took Stephen Callahan's hand. "Stephen," I said, my voice firm and clear. "Thank you for keeping your promise to my husband. Now, let's go get justice." The walk from the cafe to the police station was a journey through a world that had fundamentally, irrevocably changed. The air itself felt different, charged with the grim finality of the truth we now carried. Stephen walked beside me, a steady, silent presence, the brown leather folder tucked securely under his arm. It no longer felt like just a collection of papers and recordings. It felt like a casket carrying the corpses of my sons' souls, and the undeniable proof of their monstrous crime. Each step was a move on a chessboard, a deliberate advance toward a checkmate I had never wanted to play. We entered the station, and Sergeant O'Connell was still there, finishing up paperwork from the evening shift. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw me return, and then again when he took in the tall, serious man accompanying me. "Margot, is everything all right?" he asked, his gaze flicking to Stephen. "No, Miles, everything is not all right," I said, my voice echoing with a strange, hollow calm in the quiet station. "But we are here to make it right. This is Stephen Callahan. Ernest hired him." I turned to Stephen. "This is Sergeant O'Connell." The two men shook hands, a silent understanding passing between them. Stephen placed the folder on the counter. "Sergeant, we are here to file a formal complaint and provide you with evidence for the murder of Ernest Hayes and the conspiracy to commit the murder of Margot Hayes. For the next 2 hours, we built our case piece by devastating piece in that small, fluorescent-lit room." Stephen was methodical, a professional laying out a blueprint of evil. He started with the financial records, showing the desperate debts that formed the motive. He presented the bank statements with the unauthorized withdrawals, showing the pattern of financial manipulation and theft. Then, he handed over Ernest's notes and his final, searing letter to me. Sergeant O'Connell read Ernest's words, his face growing pale. "He knew," he murmured, shaking his head. "My God, the poor man knew." "He did," I said, my voice thick. And he tried to stop it. Then came the centerpiece of our case. Stephen set the digital recorder on the desk. "I need you to hear these, Sergeant. I obtained these recordings under the authorization of Ernest Hayes himself, who feared for his life." He pressed play. The first recording of Ernest's voice, filled with fear and suspicion, filled the room. The sergeant listened, his expression growing graver by the second. Then came Charles's voice, cold and calculating, discussing methanol and his mother being no problem. The sergeant's jaw tightened. When Henry's voice came on, detailing the symptoms of the poison with such clinical detachment, referring to his own father as an idiot, Sergeant O'Connell closed his eyes for a moment, as if in physical pain. The final recording, the one where they planned my murder, my own suicide, seemed to suck all the air out of the room. The silence that followed was heavier than any I had ever known. This is monstrous," Sergeant O'Connell finally said, his voice a low rumble of disbelief and anger. "Are you sure you want to go through with this, Margot? Once I make this call, once we arrest your sons, there's no turning back. It will tear this town apart. It will tear you apart." I looked at him, all the pain and fury of the last few weeks coalescing into a single, unshakable point of resolve. "Sergeant," I said, my voice clear and steady, "those men in those recordings murdered my husband in cold blood for money. They were planning to murder me, too. They are no longer my sons. The boys I raised died a long time ago. These are criminals who must pay for their crimes. There is nothing left to tear apart. He held my gaze for a long moment, seeing the steel that had replaced the shattered pieces of my heart. He gave a single, sharp nod. All right, then. He immediately picked up the phone and called the district attorney. Despite the late hour, the gravity of the evidence compelled the DA to come to the station personally. District Attorney Helen Wright was a severe, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s. She listened without interruption as Stephen walked her through the entire case, playing the key recordings again. Her face, a professional mask of neutrality, could not hide the flicker of horror in her eyes. When the recording of my sons planning my death finished, she let out a slow, controlled breath. This is the most compelling and, frankly, the most disturbing evidence I have ever seen in a case of this nature, she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. The premeditation is staggering. She turned to Sergeant O'Connell. Miles, I am authorizing arrest warrants for Charles Hayes and Henry Hayes for the charges of first-degree murder in the death of Ernest Hayes and conspiracy to commit murder in the planned death of Margot Hayes. We'll need to move before they can destroy any evidence or act on their threat against Mrs. Hayes. We'll need the medical examiner to exhume Ernest's body to confirm the presence of methanol. Sergeant O'Connell added, looking at me. Are you prepared for that, Margot? It's a difficult thing. Do whatever is necessary, I replied without a moment's hesitation. Let the truth be found, no matter where it lies. The plan was set in motion with a grim efficiency. The arrests would be made at dawn, at their respective homes, to minimize the chance of a confrontation, or escape. Stephen insisted on walking me home. The streets were dark and quiet, the town asleep, oblivious to the storm about to break. Are you sure you'll be okay alone? Stephen asked, his concern evident as we reached my porch. I can stay. They might try to contact you. I'll be fine, I said, and for the first time, I truly believed it. After everything I've discovered, I'm no longer afraid of them. I have justice on my side now, and I have you. I offered him a small, weary smile. Thank you, Stephen, for everything. He nodded. I made a promise. Get some rest if you can. I'll be nearby. Call me if anything happens. I went inside and locked the door. But I didn't go to bed. I couldn't. I sat in the kitchen in the dark, looking at the photographs of Ernest on the walls. The smiling man in those pictures had no idea of the betrayal that awaited him. For the first time since his death, the pain was joined by a strange, cold sense of satisfaction. He would have his justice. The truth he had died trying to uncover would be shouted from the rooftops. My phone rang at 6 a.m., shattering the pre-dawn silence. The caller ID showed Charles. My heart stuttered, but my hand was steady as I picked it up. Mom? His voice was strained, urgent. You need to come to Henry's house right away. Something terrible has happened. I knew it was a trap. I had heard their plan on the recording. They were panicking, moving their timeline up. They wanted me isolated, vulnerable. What happened? I asked, feigning concern. It's better if I explain it in person. Please, Mom, come quickly. I'm on my way, I lied. I did not go to Henry's house. I stayed in my kitchen, waiting. I watched the sky lighten from black to deep blue, then to a soft, rosy gray. I was a statue, a sentinel waiting for the dawn of a new, terrible day. At 7:30, I saw them from my window. 2 police cars, their lights off but moving, with purpose, turned down the street toward Charles's rented house in town. A few minutes later, another 2 cruisers sped off in the direction of Henry's condo on the outskirts. The hunt was on. My phone began to ring incessantly. First Charles, Then Henry, their voices growing increasingly frantic and desperate with each call. "Mom, where are you? Mom, pick up, it's an emergency. You have to come now." I didn't answer a single one. I let them ring. Let them feel a fraction of the panic and helplessness they had inflicted on their father. Let them wonder. Let them fear. At 9 a.m., there was a firm, deliberate knock on my door. I took a deep breath, smoothed my dress, and opened it. Sergeant O'Connell stood on my porch, his face etched with the gravity of the morning's events. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice formal yet kind. "We've arrested Charles and Henry. They are in police custody, charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder." I felt my legs tremble, but this time it wasn't from fear or grief. It was from a profound, bone-deep relief. The weight of the world, the weight of the secret, seemed to lift from my shoulders. "How did they react?" I asked, my voice quiet. "Charles denied everything at first," the sergeant reported, "put on quite a show of injured innocence, but when we played him the recording of his own voice planning the poisoning, he collapsed. Just folded in on himself. Henry, he tried to escape. Bolted out the back window of his house. We had to chase him for 6 blocks before we cornered him in an alley. He fought, screamed that it was all a lie. He shook his head. They're in separate cells now. It's over, Margot. The worst of it is over." I thanked him, and he left. I closed the door and leaned against it, the silence of the house now a different kind of silence. It was no longer the silence of absence, but the silence after a storm. The battle was won. The serpents had been captured. But as I stood there in the quiet of my home, I knew the war was not over. There would be a trial. There would be more pain, more public scrutiny, more having to relive the horror. And there was the vast, empty landscape of my life ahead, a life without my husband, and now, officially, without my sons. Justice had been served, but it was a hollow, devastating victory. I had lost everything. But I had, against all odds, reclaimed the one thing they had tried to steal from me, the truth. And for now, that had to be enough. Chapter 11. The Trial of a Mother's Heart. The weeks between the arrests and the trial were a strange, suspended period of time, a limbo between the storm of discovery and the tempest of public judgment. The news spread through Spring Creek like a wildfire, leaving a trail of ash and disbelief in its wake. The Hayes case was all anyone could talk about. Whispers followed me everywhere I went, to the grocery store, to the post office. I saw the looks, pity, horror, curiosity, and sometimes a flicker of ugly suspicion that perhaps I was somehow to blame. I held my head high. I was no longer just Margot Hayes, the grieving widow. I was now Margot Hayes, the woman who had sent her own sons to jail for murder. My home, once a sanctuary, became a fortress. Stephen Callahan became my steadfast general, my buffer against the world. He handled the media, coordinated with the district attorney, and most importantly, he was there, a quiet, solid presence in my kitchen most evenings, ensuring I ate, that I slept, that I did not shatter under the immense pressure. Our relationship, born from the darkest of circumstances, had deepened into a profound and loyal friendship. He was the keeper of Ernest's final wish, and he took that duty with a solemnity I will be forever grateful for. Charles and Henry were denied bail, deemed a flight risk and a danger to the community and to me. I received one letter from Henry, a rambling, desperate scrawl filled with pleas and excuses, blaming Charles, blaming Jasmine, blaming the pressure of his debts. I read it once, my heart a confused tumult of maternal instinct and icy rage. Then I placed it in a shoebox and put it in the back of my closet. I could not afford to soften. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The day of the trial arrived, cloaked in a bleak, drizzling rain that seemed to weep for all of us. The courthouse was a grand, imposing building of gray stone, and it was surrounded by a throng of reporters and spectators. It felt like a carnival of death. Stephen, a rock in a tailored suit, guided me through the chaos, his hand a firm anchor on my elbow. Doris was there too, her face pale but determined, squeezing my hand before we entered the lion's den. The courtroom was packed, every wooden bench filled. The air was thick with a stifling mixture of anticipation and morbid curiosity. I saw neighbors, former customers of Ernest's shop, even my old sewing clients. Their eyes were on me as I walked to the front, following the prosecutor, a severe and brilliant woman named Helen Wright. I wore my best black dress, the same one I had worn for Ernest's funeral. Today, it was not just a symbol of mourning, but a suit of armor. Then they brought them in. Charles and Henry, shackled at the wrists and ankles, dressed in bright orange prison jumpsuits that screamed guilty to the world. The sight was a physical blow, a fresh wound torn open in my soul. These were the babies I had swaddled, the boys whose fevers I had nursed. Now they were felons, their faces pale and drawn behind a mask of sullen defiance. Charles would not look at me. Henry stared, his eyes filled with a toxic brew of fear and accusation. My heart broke for the 1,000th time, not for the men they were, but for the ghosts of the children they had once been. The trial began. The prosecutor, Miss Wright, was methodical and devastating. She laid out the case not as a story of family drama, but as a cold, calculated business transaction that had ended in murder. She presented the financial records, the mountain of debt. She called the bank manager, Mrs. Thompson, who confirmed Charles's presence during the large withdrawals, her testimony painting a picture of a son manipulating his aging father. Then she played the recordings. The first time Ernest's voice filled the courtroom, a collective gasp rippled through the audience. To hear the victim's own fears in his own voice was chilling. Then came Charles's voice. "The old man is starting to get suspicious. I already have the methanol. Mom won't be a problem." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft mechanical whir of the recorder. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, on the judge's bench, refusing to look at the jury, refusing to look at my sons. I could feel the horror radiating from the people behind me. When Henry's recording played, detailing the symptoms of the poison with such vile nonchalance, I heard a woman sob. When the final recording, the one plotting my own murder, echoed under the vaulted ceiling, the room seemed to collectively hold its breath. The plan for my suicide laid bare their utter depravity. I felt Stephen's hand find mine under the table, a brief, grounding squeeze. The defense attorneys, two slick-looking men from the city, tried their best. They argued desperation, external pressures, the corrupting influence of debt. They tried to suggest the recordings were taken out of context, that it was just boys blowing off steam. But the words were too specific, too cold, too damning. The recordings were not a fantasy. They were a blueprint, and Ernest's death was the finished product. Then it was my turn. When they called my name, my legs felt like water, but my mind was clear. I walked to the witness stand, the eyes of the entire town upon me. I swore to tell the truth, and I knew I finally could. "Mrs. Hayes," Miss Wright began, her voice softer than it had been with other witnesses. "Can you tell us what your relationship was like with your sons before your husband's murder?" I took a deep breath. "I thought I had a good relationship with them," I said, my voice clear and carrying to the back of the room. I forced myself to look at Charles and Henry. I raised them with all the love I had. I sacrificed for them. Their father worked from sunup to sundown to give them a good life, a life of honesty and hard work. I never, not in my worst nightmares, imagined that love and sacrifice would become the reason for his murder. At any point, Did you suspect they could harm your husband? No. The word was a painful admission. That is the most painful part of all this. I trusted them completely. When they told me Ernest had an accident at his shop, I believed them. When they organized the funeral so quickly, I thought they were being efficient in their grief. I was blind. I was a mother, and I was blind. I never imagined they were covering up a murder. I saw Charles lower his head, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Henry continued to stare, but I saw the sheen of tears in his eyes now. Tears that were far, far too late. The most dramatic moment came when Miss Wright decided to play the full recording of the conversation where they planned my murder. She wanted the jury to understand the full scope of their ruthlessness. Charles's voice, flat and cold. Once we have Dad's insurance money, we need to get rid of Mom, too. We can't risk her getting suspicious. The gasp from the audience was louder this time. I saw several jurors flinch. One put a hand over her mouth. How did you feel when you heard this recording for the first time, Mrs. Hayes? Miss Wright asked me. I looked out at the courtroom, at the faces of my neighbors, and then finally, I let my gaze settle on my sons. I realized, I said, my voice cracking but firm, that I had lost my two sons long before I lost my husband. The babies I nursed, the children I comforted in their nightmares, had died and been replaced by two strangers capable of any cruelty for money. The men in those recordings are not my children. The defense's cross-examination was brief and brutal. They tried to suggest my grief had twisted my perception, that I was exaggerating, that a mother's love had turned to hysterical vengeance. But their words were weak, insubstantial things against the solid, unassailable wall of evidence. The recordings spoke for themselves. Stephen testified, calm and professional, detailing Ernest's hiring of him, the installation of the devices, the collection of evidence. He was unshakable. The medical examiner then took the stand, presenting the results of the exhumation. He confirmed the presence of lethal levels of methanol in Ernest's system, describing in clinical detail how it would have caused the exact symptoms Ernest experienced. He also presented the medical report from the city clinic, proving Ernest was in perfect health just days before his death. The final nail in the coffin. The closing arguments were a formality. The prosecutor was magnificent, her voice ringing with moral outrage. Charles and Henry Hayes are not victims of circumstance, she thundered. They are predators who saw their own parents as financial obstacles to be eliminated. They planned, they executed, and they covered up Ernest's murder, and they were planning to do the same to Margot. They don't deserve compassion. They deserve justice. The jury was out for 6 hours. 6 of the longest hours of my life. Stephen, Doris, and I waited in a small, stuffy room, not speaking, each lost in our own thoughts. I prayed not for vengeance, but for peace, for Ernest, for me. When we were called back into the courtroom, the silence was heavier than lead. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. The judge asked the foreman if the jury had reached a verdict. We have, Your Honor. In the case of the State versus Charles Hayes and Henry Hayes, on the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Ernest Hayes, how do you find? Guilty. The word landed, final and absolute. A wave of murmurs swept the room. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder against Margot Hayes, how do you find? Guilty. Charles let out a low moan and collapsed forward, his head in his hands. Henry remained rigid, staring straight ahead, his face a pale, expressionless mask. The judge wasted no time. He proceeded immediately to sentencing. Charles Hayes and Henry Hayes, the judge said, his voice echoing with grim finality. For the premeditated murder of your father, a man who loved and provided for you, and for the conspiracy to murder your mother, I can find no mitigating circumstances. Your actions were heinous, calculated, and devoid of any humanity. I sentence you both to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 30 years. It was over. The gavel fell. The sound was like the lid of a tomb slamming shut. There were no cheers in the courtroom, only a profound, exhausted silence. I felt Doris's arms around me, holding me as I finally, quietly, wept. They were tears, not of joy, but of release, of an ending. Stephen helped me to my feet. As we turned to leave, I took one last look at my sons. They were being led away, their orange jumpsuits a final, garish mockery of the lives they could have had. The trial was over. Justice had been served. But as I walked out of the courtroom, into the gray, weeping afternoon, I knew the trial of a mother's heart would last for the rest of my life. 5 years. A lifetime can pass in the blink of an eye, yet a single moment of pain can feel like an eternity. 5 years have passed since that terrible day in the cemetery when a single text message tore my world asunder and set me on a path I never could have imagined. Today, I am 71 years old. My hair is completely white, a silver crown that reflects all the storms I have faced and weathered. But my eyes, my dear friend Doris tells me, shine with a peace they didn't have before. The lines on my face are a map of my journey, not just of sorrow but of survival, of resilience, of a love that refused to be extinguished by the deepest betrayal. The house where Ernest and I built our dreams is still my refuge. It is no longer a museum of pain, but a living, breathing home again. I've made small improvements with the clean money from my own savings. I painted the walls a soft, buttery yellow, Ernest's favorite color, because I finally understood that the best way to honor him was not to live in the shadows of grief, but to surround myself with the light he always brought me. And the garden, is my masterpiece. Where the old bike shop once stood, a place that had become a monument to a lie, now blooms the most vibrant, life-affirming patch of beauty in all of Spring Creek. The red roses are deep and velvety, the white carnations pristine and hopeful, and the sunflowers stand tall and brave, their faces perpetually turned toward the sun, just as he taught me to do during our hardest years. Stephen Callahan became more than the investigator who helped me find justice. He became my chosen family, the brother of my heart. His Wednesday afternoon visits are the anchor of my week. We still drink coffee on the porch, the scent mingling with that of the roses. He tells me his stories, and I tell him mine, the new ones, the good ones, about the letters that arrive at the foundation. Our bond, forged in the crucible of truth, is unbreakable. He sometimes looks out over the garden, a thoughtful expression on his face, and says he'd be proud of you, Margot, for all of it. And I know, deep in my soul, that he is right. The Ernest Hayes Foundation for Victims of Family Crimes has become something far larger and more beautiful than I ever dreamed. What started as a way to cleanse a blood-stained inheritance has grown into a sanctuary for the broken. We help dozens of families every year, women who suspect a brother of murdering their mother for an inheritance, children being manipulated out of their legacies by greedy relatives, elderly parents pressured to sign away their homes. We provide them with what I so desperately needed and was so miraculously given: a skilled investigator, a compassionate lawyer, a supportive therapist. We are a lighthouse in the stormy sea of familial greed, and the beam of our light is Ernest's legacy. 6 months ago, a woman named Eleanor came to see me. She was 40, with tired, frightened eyes that reminded me of my own reflection in the dark days. She suspected her brother had murdered their mother for her property. The story was a painful echo of my own: the pressure to sell, the strange behavior after the death, the greedy relatives. The foundation provided her with a private investigator, free legal counsel, and held her hand throughout the entire, terrifying process. When her brother was convicted of murder 3 months later, Eleanor came to my office, tears streaming down her face, and hugged me as if her life depended on it. "Mrs. Hayes," she sobbed into my shoulder, "you saved my life. If you hadn't had the courage to report your own sons, I never would have had the courage to report my brother." Those are the moments. Those are the moments that silence the ghosts and heal the oldest wounds. They are the reason I can say, with absolute certainty, that all the pain I endured was worth it. My tragedy became a shield for others. My pain became their protection. Henry is still alive, in a technical, biological sense. But the man I knew is gone. After Charles's suicide, his mind broke completely. The doctors say he exists in a perpetual state of guilt and psychosis, trapped in a hell of his own making. He believes Ernest visits his cell every night to sit in silent judgment. He has tried to join his brother in death 3 times, but the fast system keeps him alive, a hollow man in a sterile room. I receive his unopened letters occasionally. The shoebox in my closet is nearly full. I have the right to my peace, and I exercise that right fiercely. Perhaps one day I will read them, perhaps I will burn them. The choice is mine, and that sovereignty over my own heart is a victory I cherish. The town of Spring Creek will never forget the case, of course. It has been woven into the fabric of the place, a local legend and a cautionary tale parents tell their children about the corrosive power of greed. Some see me as a hero. Others still whisper that I am a cold, hard woman who sent her own sons to prison. I have learned, with time, to be utterly indifferent to their opinions. I know the truth. I lived it. I carry its scars and its lessons. The truth has given me the only peace that matters. My health remains good. The doctor says, my heart is strong, my spirit stronger. The body heals when the heart finds peace, he told me, and I have become living proof of that axiom. Sunday mornings are still my favorite. The ritual is sacred to me. I take my wicker basket and my shears and I walk through my garden, choosing the most perfect blooms. Then I walk to the cemetery. The inscription on Ernest's headstone is worn slightly by 5 years of sun and rain, but the words remain true. His love was stronger than his death. I arrange the flowers in the vase, and I sit on the small stone bench beside him, and I talk. I tell him about Eleanor. I tell him about the new grant the foundation received. I tell him that the yellow roses are particularly vibrant this year. I speak to him as if he is sitting right beside me, because in so many ways he is. Do you know what's strangest, my love? I said during my last visit, my hand resting on the warm, smooth stone. I no longer feel pain when I think of Charles and Henry. I only feel pity. A deep, profound pity. Pity because they had all the love in the world and they chose hate. They had a family that adored them and they chose betrayal. They had the opportunity to be honorable men, just like you, and they chose to be murderers. Their punishment was not just the prison sentence, it was the loss of everything that truly matters. And that is a life sentence I would not wish on anyone. Last week, a reporter from the city came to interview me for a documentary about family crimes. She was young, earnest, her eyes wide with the horror of my story. She asked me if there was anything I wanted to say to other people who might be going through similar situations. I looked directly into the camera, my back straight, my voice clear. Family is not an excuse for crime, I said. Love is not blind. Love with boundaries is true love. If someone who says they love you is capable of harming you for money or convenience, that person does not really love you. And it is never, ever too late to seek justice, no matter who the culprit is. This year, on the 5th anniversary of Ernest's death, I organized a special ceremony in his memory at the community hall. I expected a few dozen people. More than 200 came. Neighbors, members of the foundation, families we had helped, the mayor, Sergeant O'Connell. The hall was filled with a quiet, powerful energy of healing and hope. It was beautiful. It was redemption. Stephen gave a speech that moved many to tears. Ernest Hayes died because of his son's greed, he said, his voice strong and sure. But his legacy lives on in every family that finds justice thanks to his wife's courage. Evil tried to destroy his story, but good turned it into hope for others. At night, before I go to sleep, I sometimes allow myself to take out the old, frayed photo album. I look at the pictures of Charles and Henry as children playing in the yard, hugging their father's legs, laughing with me on Christmases long past. I allow myself to cry for those innocent boys who once existed, before the world and their own choices corrupted them. I mourn for the potential that was wasted, but I no longer cry for the men they became. Those men chose their destiny. They authored their own tragedy. My story ended up being bigger than my personal pain. It has become a symbol, a testament that justice is possible, even when it must be sought from the most unexpected and painful of places. A 66-year-old widow proved that truth is more powerful than lies, that love is stronger than betrayal, and that it is never, ever too late to do the right thing. Tomorrow is Wednesday. Stephen will come for coffee, as he always does. I'll have his favorite pastry waiting. I'll tell him about the thank you letters that arrived this week. Afterward, we'll work together in the garden, planting new flowers for the coming spring. We will kneel in the rich, dark earth, our hands in the soil, nurturing life. Life goes on. It is simpler now, quieter, but it is more authentic than it has ever been. I have learned the hardest and most valuable lesson of all, that true family is not defined by shared blood, but by shared values, by mutual respect, and by a love that would never ever dream of causing harm. Ernest, my love, wherever you are, I hope you can see me. I hope you know that I kept the promise I made to you by your grave on that terrible, life-altering day. I found the truth. I sought justice, and I have turned our pain into a garden of peace, a shelter of hope for others. Your death was not in vain, my love. It was the seed from which my courage grew. And for that I will be forever grateful. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.